For my media presentation, I chose the book Born on a Blue Day by Daniel Tammet, and the title of the book actually comes from his experiences with synesthesia, meaning he associates different days or words or shapes or numbers together. And the day he was born, January 31st, 1979, he associates with the color blue, so he was born on a blue day. So a bit about the book. It's just basically talking about his life and how he's overcome these difficulties living with Asperger's syndrome, which is an autistic spectrum disorder, as well as savant syndrome, which is actually kind of an advantage. It's really an incredible syndrome. It's an incredible syndrome where he excels in math. He also had epilepsy in his earlier years of life, which was eradicated with medication, which is very good. And also one of the notable things he's done in his life is he actually beat the world record in 2004 for pi memorization with 22,514 digits memorized, which is obviously almost superhuman and absolutely incredible. So Asperger's syndrome is an autistic spectrum disorder. There's a little bit of a controversy on whether it's kind of its own category or whether it just falls somewhere on the spectrum. But it's a neurobiological disorder that causes simply a deficiency in social skills. It also means that it causes things like symptoms like having a special interest, something that they're really focused on, or talking formally, or having stimulations, so being able to touch different things without process, because sometimes they get an information overload. One thing that's actually noticeable in a brain scan, comparing someone with an autistic syndrome disorder versus a control subject who would have no mental disabilities, is the size of the amygdala. So the amygdala is shown here, this kind of greenish yellow little spot, and it's responsible for mood, emotional behavior, motivation, stuff like fear. And in the brain scans of people with autism spectrum disorders, it's noticeably smaller, consistently, than people with than control subjects. They've actually done experiments where they've taken the amygdala out of animals to see its effects, and they found that the animals had no fear, which is kind of interesting. Obviously, that plays a role in that. However, the smaller amygdala probably has a lot to do with emotional disconnection and more logical thinking in people with Asperger's disorder, as well as social anxiety and being more introverted and not necessarily having emotions as strong. So white and gray matter in the central nervous system. White matter is much more condensed in the central nervous system, meaning the spinal cord and the brain. The only difference between white and gray matter is that white matter is myelinated. So being myelinated means that the axon of the nerve cell is covered in myelin sheaths. So myelin sheaths are these things that go on the axon, and when the action potential comes down from the dendrites, rather than just moving across the axon like it would in other kind of neurons, it jumps over the myelin sheaths in order to move more efficiently. And that's why these white matter cells, which are myelinated, gray matter is not, the white cells are more condensed in the spinal cord and the brain, because that's where the most messages are going through. So in the brains of people with Asperger's, white and gray matter is slightly different, although it is mostly the same because obviously it's not affecting everything. People with autism spectrum disorders are found to have a deficiency of gray matter in the cerebellar region, which is found to cause learning deficiencies or developmental problems. It actually ranges differently from individual to individual on how much gray matter they have, but there's also found to have abnormal amounts of white matter, which also ranges from individual to individual, whether that's more than average or less. However, there's also a deficiency of gray matter around the frontostriatal pathways, which leads to defective sensory motor gating. So here's just a diagram of white matter and gray matter. White matter is definitely more in the middle, and gray matter is more surrounding, and it's the same in the spinal cord because the gray matter kind of forms a C shape around the white. So the frontostriatal circuit pathway connects the frontal lobe to the basal ganglia, frontal lobe in blue, basal ganglia in pink right here. Simply put, the frontal lobe is responsible for things like language, movement, and cognitive skills, whereas the basal ganglia is responsible for things like learning, behavior, and executive functions. So sensory motor gating, as we talked about in the last two slides, is caused by that deficiency of gray matter in the frontostriatal pathway. It's a lot like what it sounds like, sensory motor gating. It kind of gates information or filters through it to actually decide what's necessary. So using this example, this represents someone with schizophrenia, and this would be a control subject with no mental disabilities. This kind of screen here, this little box, is kind of a metaphor for the mechanism of sensory motor gating in the way that it blocks some information from being relevant. If the information isn't strong enough, if the stimulant coming through sensory neurons isn't important, or it doesn't have any kind of effect on homeostasis, then the brain deems it irrelevant because it's not going to affect the internal environment of your body at all. If it was a millionth of a degree warmer, then it's not really relevant and it doesn't really affect any of your bodily functions. So sensory motor gating and Asperger's, with people with autism spectrum disorders, sensory motor gating is defective, and it mostly leads to an overall change of image of people with autism spectrum disorders, because they tend to have repetitive thoughts or actions, for example, going like this, moving my hand, or tapping your leg as a stimulant to calm yourself. It also leads to information overload. So because your brain is receiving all that information rather than just a portion of it, your brain takes a lot longer to process, obviously, a much larger amount of information. So Asperger's and homeostasis, as I mentioned earlier, the smaller amygdala, it doesn't really have an effect on homeostasis because even though it has a smaller size, it's still completing the functions. However, people with autistic spectrum disorders do have more easily excitable neurons, meaning that action potential is completed more easily. So this would be an action potential graph, this being the time voltage of someone with no mental disabilities and normal excitable neurons. So these are failed initiations, meaning that the stimulant wasn't strong enough to reach the threshold, so the action potential couldn't go through this whole thing of depolarizing, repolarizing, and then hyperpolarization. But if the neuron was more easily excitable, then these failed initiations actually would have turned into this whole action potential graph, and that is what's happening when the stimulants are being processed in people with autism spectrum disorders. So on to the next syndrome, which is savant syndrome. And this is actually really what makes Daniel Tammet so unique and what makes his story so interesting. And savant syndrome is absolutely amazing, and there's so many examples of amazing people who have accomplished incredible things because of this uniqueness. So savant syndrome is when someone with a mental disability is unexpectedly and exceptionally strong in one area. The reason that it's so unexpected is because of that mental disability. They have a lower IQ, and even though IQs aren't the most concise way to measure intelligence, they still count for something. So when someone with a low IQ is absolutely almost more than human, way above average in one particular area, like math or memorization or reading, history. It's obviously very amazing. So for Daniel Tammet, he was amazing with math. As I said, he memorized 22,514 digits of pi, but taking advantage of his synesthesia, this is how he would picture numbers. So if this was a multiplication question, then we could say that this shape was the one that was absolutely unique to the number 3. So no other number looked like this, and this could be the number 5. So then this shape that's created in between the two shapes would be the product of the two numbers. So this could be 15. If this was 3 and 5, 3 times 5 equals 15. So the hypothesized cause of savant syndrome is that there is an injury sustained to the left hemisphere of the brain, and the right hemisphere, using neuroplasticity, took over those functions and not only compensated, but overcompensated. So the left side of the brain is responsible for things like memory, reading, writing, number skills, science, whereas the right hemisphere is responsible for things like creativity, imagination, music. So when those left functions are being overcompensated for, those math skills, specifically in this situation, are much stronger, and that's what's going to be, way above average. So neuroplasticity, which is the cause of all this, neuroplasticity doesn't only happen when there's an injury sustained, it also happens all the time. So for example, when you meet a new stimulant, your brain creates a new neural pathway for it, and with neural pruning, it gets rid of the old ones that you're not using anymore, so that instead it can push its resources towards strengthening the new one. So here's a good example, not an example, sorry, but a nice diagram to show that these neurons are being connected. It's making a new pathway for a new way of communication, a new way that the action potential can move through. So with savant syndrome, instead of neural pruning happening, the injury would have been what kind of got rid of those old pathways, so that the right hemisphere was forced to make new pathways to the left hemisphere in order to complete those functions. Because without the left hemisphere, your whole right side of your body would basically be useless, and obviously that's not very efficient for our brain trying to maintain homeostasis. So maintaining homeostasis is basically the whole reason that savant syndrome even exists. If the brain had no intention of maintaining homeostasis, then realistically the right hemisphere would have no reason to take on the functions of the left. But because you need both sides of your brain, the right side had to at least compensate, let alone overcompensate, for those sides. In order for the right hemisphere to have been so effective, the injury had to have been sustained when the individual was young, because that's when your brain is making the most neural pathways, because it's encountering the most new stimulants. So younger children have significantly fewer pathways because they're constantly building them. Every single time that they encounter something new, a new pathway, and then every time that they encounter it again, it strengthens itself. When you're younger, you're more likely to be able to fix the damage because, your brain is already making those neural pathways, and you grow a lot when you're young. Even your brain grows too. On to the third thing, which is epilepsy and seizures. Daniel Tammet had them when he was younger, but medication is very strong in our modern day society, so they were completely eradicated, but I will explain them anyways. So seizures and epilepsy differ from each other. A seizure can be epileptic and it can be non-epileptic. So if it's not epileptic, it's kind of a random occurrence. So seizures them alone can be caused by anything like high or low blood pressure, high or low sodium, fever, alcohol or drug withdrawal. Whereas epilepsy is a neurological disorder, and it's caused by any kind of damage to the brain, whether that be a tumor or stroke, or it could be genetic. And there's two types of seizures themselves, and that's generalized and focal. Generalized is when the misfire of neurons is basically your whole brain, and focal is when that misfire is contained one area. So neurotransmitters effects on seizures. Neurotransmitters are the messages that neurons send between each other. So using this example here would be neurotransmitters, and here's the receptors. So this is the first neuron, this is the second neuron, and they come through, and the receptors grab them, and then they go through the axon, changing the membrane potential, action potential, all that thing going through. Using the example of, we'll say, an antidepressant like alcohol, all antidepressants rely on the release and the production of serotonin and dopamine, basically. So with that hormone imbalance, it can actually cause a misfire. Because they're imbalanced, obviously, the balance of homeostasis is what your body is constantly trying to maintain, and so that's why there's a specific amount of these hormones. But when an antidepressant like alcohol or any kind of drug comes in and changes the balance of hormones, it causes a hormone imbalance, which can cause neurons to misfire. So this would be normal activity, and this is what can cause a seizure, is when these neurons are miscommunicating between each other with the wrong amount or the wrong kind or the wrong time for neurotransmitters to come out. So going back to seizures with homeostasis, obviously that's not homeostasis. What your brain does afterwards to recover is you're trying to return to homeostasis, because seizures can really be anything from a staring spell to full body convulsions. But in conclusion, this book was really interesting, and it kind of talking about just the life of Daniel Tammet is really inspiring, and it gave him motivation to want to research more about autism spectrum disorders and become more knowledgeable.